Hello and welcome to the Arts Are Education Talk It Up podcast, where we talk to national, state, and local leaders who are working to make arts education part of every student's life. I am Jim Palmerini, your host. This podcast is part of our series, Meet NCAS, in which I talk to representatives of the member organizations of the National Coalition for Art Standards. That's ARE's sponsoring network. NCAS is a collaboration of 8 national arts and arts education organizations who actively work to ensure quality, standards-based arts education opportunities for every student. So over the past few months, I've been talking to their leadership about the organizations themselves and their perspective about the foundational focus of NCAS, that is K-12 arts education standards and their importance to their members and to the field. Today, we are talking to David Dick, Executive Director of the Young Audiences Arts for Learning. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Jim. It's a great honor to be here. So I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you today.
And I am so thrilled you are here. So let's get started. Tell me about Young Audiences, its history and its mission and its goals.
Yeah, I mean, what is it and what isn't it, right? So we just celebrated our 70th anniversary. So it's interesting to look at the field going back to 1952. And with that, in 1952, it's interesting that at the close of the Second World War and as the Iron Curtain descended across Eastern Europe, there were a number of musicians that ended up in this country with literally no place to perform, no place to do that work. And quickly, at a time where there's a very strong ecosystem of what arts offerings look like in schools, I say a strong ecosystem, but I think if we look back on it, very much performance directed, very much a singular perspective of that. But it came up as an opportunity of, are these some great ideas, and shouldn't this be a great way to bring musicians into schools to help kind of lift up that, right? And that notion of performance, I think, is important in the ecosystem of what arts offerings provide. It doesn't stand on its own; it needs other pieces with that. But at that time, it was definitely sort of a music-centered approach. Through its growth, kind of in the early 70s, it started looking at all forms of music. Coming into the 1980s, started looking at all art forms. And I think what we have today is a network of 30 independent 501c3 organizations who are part of the Young Audiences National Affiliate Network. So, Jim, with that, the fact that they're all their own separate 501c3s, right, of which those executive directors serve at the pleasure of their boards, I try not to think of it as a top-down organization. I'm always a little leery of the headquarters in New York City that often carries with that we what we know, and our job is really how do we build the capacity and share the best practices possible for our affiliates to make the best decisions for their local constituency, right? We work primarily in that arts integrated space, and I think it's important because as we think about that partnership with a teaching artist, an outside organization, the certified arts teacher, and how do we bring the classroom teacher into that? I want to be really careful that our work is not really about direct content instruction. That's for other people, right? But our role is really how do we translate both the content, but more importantly, the experiences and the methodologies and predispositions of the arts into other areas. It opens up differentiated instruction for students, but also gives us better insight on how students learn. And Jim, I know in your career, for instance, in theater, we've seen kids that thrive in that theater place. They go back to the classroom, everything's as it was, and they don't see the same success.
Right.
And the minute that teacher figures out, wait a minute, let me get that kid on their feet, right? Let's not do a book report. Let's act this out. If we really want to get an understanding of a book we're reading, ask students to create a costume design. around what they're reading and give me two elements that I don't know yet, right? And go back to the text and pick that out. So how do we continue to differentiate? And I think that's kind of the role that we try to play, in that work, is really looking at how do we think of the arts as language systems that translate throughout the school day, and quite frankly, just make the day a lot more interesting for kids.
So here's a follow-up question about young audiences' evolution that you talked about. After the Iron Curtain fell and so forth, there were so many musicians that came over. What's interesting to me is how young audience has evolved over the years to embrace other arts areas as well. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, you look at one step, and you build obviously these tight relationships around music, but then you look at visual arts. Jim, in a lot of schools, you look at theater and dance, and you ask, where is it, right? And then just how do you start to look at these other art forms that, if we are thinking, especially today, all arts for all kids, it can't be just done by playing in a wind ensemble, right? So that started, to be quite frank, that starts to open up a discussion when you're really then creating partnerships with schools and not just delivering content, right? So as that moved, and then obviously the next big piece here is really about media arts, which I think, Jim, transcends all art forms, but at the same time is its own art form, with a use of technology that continues to change. I've not wrapped my head around this yet, but boy,
nobody has.
AI should have something to inform about that, right? It's very interesting. If media arts is about taking the technology we have today, right? But then what is still the essence of the human contribution to all that, right? And so we look at technology to assist a lot of things. And boy, we need to find a room just to sit and kind of think about that for a while. If we can be futurists, and we probably can't, but where's the space for those other pieces? So Jim, to that point, I mean, we do a lot of work in sound engineering with students, right? We do a lot of work with just thinking about video and filmmaking, and where do you find student voice? But again, we are directly dependent on those certified arts teachers who are teaching the language and content to make that happen. I'll end, Jim. I was at an interesting session last Friday where we started to move into that conversation of, but however, don't teaching artists displace the work of others, right? And I said at one point, I can make a really compelling argument that because we integrate language arts and social studies, and we integrate it in math, and we integrate it into science, we write lab reports, we write essays, we write all those things. We don't need a language arts class. That's done everywhere else. And you can quickly go to that point of, no, we need a place to teach content and structure and meaning and history and content. That's the doorway then where you bring the arts in. You need those languages taught other places in order to then integrate that language into instruction and experience.
This is a great segue into a discussion about standards, because you talked about a segue, translation, and so forth. What is the role of art standards in K-12 arts education? And I'll just sort of blend that question, that brings together both the classroom educator and the teaching artist, if that makes sense.
It does. And, as I've just sort of described what these ideal things look like, kind of in what art instruction is, right?
Right.
I think about then that rural school that might be 100 kids, right? And that could be 100 kids K through 12, right? I think about those small educational experiences in a place like New York City, where you may have a couple, maybe 100, 150 kids at the most, right? So this blurring over that many times there are cultural organizations who have the capacity to think long-term in their work. As one, Jim, these organizations are coming in and out. If we do not use the standards, then that work does not become child and student-centered, right? So I think knowing where students are, and often the power of those art standards has been, and as you know, with that ability in the arts website to be able to design these customized books. You may be working with a group of fifth graders in theater, but it's the very first time they've had theater. So you might have to go back and look at second grade or third grade standards. More importantly, you have to go back and look at what are those essential questions and enduring understandings that are embedded in that work. And with that, I think those standards provide an incredible opportunity to think about what is the IEP for every student in the room, right? And then working with those other curricular areas, and by the way, I avoid at all costs this notion of arts and academics. It's a false dichotomy, right?
Yep,
It's
agreed.
humanities and sciences, right? And we know the primary language of the arts is sciences, right? I mean, that's how it's all constructed: shape, space, design, movement, all of that. Without those standards, we cannot create partnerships between teaching artists and teachers that go and basically define the needs of students. Otherwise, we're delivering experiences, really good experiences, but we're just delivering something of which the next morning one says, okay, that was great, let's get back to work. With the standards, this is the work, right? And like I said, it moves everybody to that discussion of who is the student, what are the needs, and with a set of standards, then we can say, all right, at the end of this experience, the end of this residency, the end of this year, this is where we want to be, right? And that's the bucket you hand on to the next year, right? But unless we have those standards, we can't have those conversations.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about the moment in which the teaching artist and the classroom educator come together. Mm-hmm. And I would think about, one of the things we talk about is targeted learning goals.
Yep.
And here's a follow-up question. Does that then, with that collaboration, allow them to move forward in a mutual way towards assessing learning? Standards.
Yeah, I mean, the secret of assessing learning is you have to articulate at the beginning what is it that you want students to know and be able to do and learn. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think, and what's exciting about the standards, as students get older in the process, you're really engaging them in the work, right down to those standards immediately lend to what is a rubric, what is the understanding, what does the work look like, how do students start to self-assess their own work and the work of others. Probably one of the most important pieces we bring into the arts is how do we take and receive criticism, right? Especially in a day and age where we need to learn other people's viewpoints and opinions without hating them at the same time.
You
right?
bet.
You bet. I mean, that's spot on there. So what I'm really interested is, and especially with those standards in place, I think this partnership that's evolved, it's much more than just bringing the content into the classroom. This is now about what is rehearsal, revision, empathy, understanding, taking criticism, receiving criticism, how to write it, all these incredible skills that, quite frankly, those are the skills that sustain a workforce that might have part of the work in a remote or technology area where they're not coming into an office, right?
Regardless of whether they're working directly in the arts or not.
That's right. I mean, those are the pieces. And also really good elements for really good artists as well, who often, the great part of that process and how we integrate that back into the work is, we have also, though, too many artists who can't receive criticism. They just want to stay in that silo. They just want to practice. They just want to, and then, the interesting part to me always comes that when you're really looking and unpacking those art standards throughout the board, it moves us beyond just the performance, right? And during COVID, it was our ability to respond, to create, and to connect that sustained that work. Not just, quick, how do I get a group of kids, to sing in Zoom, in a synchronous fashion, right? So, in a way, it kind of opened up the process, right? But obviously, one of those key elements of why those standards are important is this has to be more than just the fall play and the spring musical, or the winter concert and the spring concert, right? It has to be those places where Where do students write their own work? Where do we allow opportunities for kids to conduct? Where, in those standards, how do we keep a process portfolio of our visual artwork? How do we take dance and think about choreography, not just taking the direction of others, right? I mean, these are the pieces that the standards really open up, that whether you're going to be an artist or not, authentic and thorough process always leads to a product or a moment in time that we look at that I think has full value to everybody in a day and age where less and less is it about the right and the wrong answer.
If I'm following you, I love what you had to say about what it would sound like that both student and educator, whether teaching artist or classroom teacher, benefits from engaging in these standards. For example, it sounds like standards prompt reflection on the part of the teaching artist. I would think, in particular, who's in their own particular lane, to prompt them to maybe think differently about their own work.
Yeah.
So there is that value. So this moves us into our third question. We've already been talking about this anyway, but how have the 2014 National Art Standards that have been adapted by, I think, close to 40 states at this point, impacted young audiences members and the teaching artists field in general? What do you think?
It's a lot of things. I've always found standards create a language of diplomacy and neutrality in your work, right? It's no longer about what you do. It's no longer about what the other person does. It creates a language that hopefully transcends that, right? And it's very clear there what those holistic processes look like, right? Now, one is, however, many artists were not kind of raised in that inquiry-based, sort of premise that the standards are built in, right? A lot of artists have been very good at being to basically do what they've been told to do, right? I always look at what's the impact of the standards in music instruction. When a conductor stops during a rehearsal, do they tell you what's wrong, or do they ask you, why do you think I just stopped? Right?
I love that.
So one thing I found incredibly impactful within our network is that notion that the standards always bring you back to a place of inquiry, not a place of just, let's move forward with it, right? You need to do this, let's do it again, right? And the standards build that place also many times, I think, for teachers and artists alike, that many times the student in your room has the better solution or the more innovative idea of kind of what to do next. So that's incredibly important. Second thing I found with artists is especially this challenge of, what does third grade look like versus fourth grade? Who are the students? Yes, it's great to know developmentally what a fourth grader should be able to know and do. And you need that information when you walk in, because not every fourth grader is working at a fourth grade level. The arts do provide an opportunity to work with kids who are working at an eighth grade level, with kids who are working at a second grade level. Boy, does it create a medium to bring in special needs students where English is a second language as well. So how do we really continue then that those standards do become a platform, especially that I've seen in teaching artists, to think about how are we our own action researchers of that work? And one of the strengths one of the assets, that a teaching artist brings into their work is they work with a lot of different kids all over the map, right? So the strength of a teacher is they've got that group, and they're working with that group, especially in the arts, many years in a row. You're bringing in that artist, bringing all different perspectives from school and community-based work. And then those standards create the discussion we have, not about the work, as opposed to, hey, just have a seat on the side, I'm about to do my show, right? The thing I perfected really well. And I also want to mention in that yes, we talk a lot about teaching artists. That there is a role also for the visiting artist in this work, right? As you know, seeing something done really well is a great opportunity for kids. You need someone to be able to translate it, though.
Yeah.
That could be the visiting artist. It might not, right?
Yeah.
So I think the standards always create this conversation of where are we, and making sure that's a student-centered conversation that's really based on outcomes rather than an input delivery conversation.
I think it's great to mention the opportunity to witness excellence. I think is important. And I want to ask a secondary question about in our post-pandemic era of education about learning loss, and how important is it, therefore, because in those classes, the gradation of learning, the difference between the third and the fourth and the fifth grade, now perhaps is even greater than what it's been in the past, because some students, families had the opportunity or the ability to compensate for that time at home and that learning lost time. So the standards, can they also play a role in addressing learning loss today, in maybe not specifically in the arts and maybe in learning in general?
Well, I think they do, because in order to determine learning loss, learning recovery, whatever we want to call it, we need a better understanding of where is that student right now.
Right.
And those standards help to identify that place, at least, right? So, what's great is in the states where they really look at grade bands for the standards,
Yeah.
because the national standards are written grade by grade, it just provides further articulation of what that looks like. But the first thing is you have to diagnose the problem, as it were. Where are we? So that the standards are able to do that, right? And ensemble work, not everyone has to work at the same level. I mean, it's the difference between whether you're playing first trumpet, second trumpet, or third trumpet, right? So just to kind of have a better understanding of that. But Jim, I've been doing a lot of reading, especially about looking at national standardized tests in math. And I realize math so much is about the fluency and literacy of the language, right? The minute you have to think about what's 7 + 5, and you can't get in, you're in a blank stare of what that means. Part of it is that language and that recall, right? Now, to think about an arts integrated approach that differentiates the way we approach that, because we just can't expect kids to do the same thing the same time and get the same results everywhere. But I've realized also that when so much of that math was delivered online, it's so easy to get the wrong answer, go back and look at the correction, go, oh, okay, I get it, and move on to the next, right?
Without really thinking about it.
Instruction is about how do you keep looking at that and that approach. And then math, like the arts, it's cumulative. What you learn day one, you have to apply day 100. You get to day 100 and you're doing slope intercept form, and you're doing, looking at algebraic equations, and still you can't answer what's 7 + 5, right? So with that, again, I think those standards at least help where we are. And that also, all standards don't have equal weight and equal time. There are things, again, how you put this together. But I think the great thing with those standards that we have also is you teach no standard in isolation, right? The best work is when you are creating and reflecting and performing and connecting all at the same time. And you're using those pieces constantly to go back, and they all play different parts, right? So, what I'm thrilled about as a field is we have a set of standards that are adaptable and adoptable, and I think teachers and students take ownership of it. And we're one of the few fields that really look at the fluidity of those different experiences, and how does a theater standard help to inform a music standard that thinks about, you think about, music theater, right? How many different places it hits every single standard that's there. And with that, we've got a set of standards that are really designed to enable teachers and teaching artists to do their best work. I'm not as familiar with the others, but as you know, we create a set of standards from bottom up, not top down. Right. And most arts educators, if you ask them what the standards are, they're going to tell you either one of those P's: producing, performing, presenting, creating, responding, connecting. They got that. And I'm not sure every field can do that, but very much we are one of the few fields where we use public demonstration to show what students know and are able to do.
That, I think, David, public presentations to show what students know and know how to do is a great coda to our conversation. That makes so much sense to me. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
This has been really fun and informative, and we could probably talk another hour, but we're not going to do that today.
Well, you could start a whole after hour series, right? So
yeah, that's my next project, after hours with NCAS. So
there you go.
Thank you again for being here. I'm going to do the awkward business of resharing my screen for a second. Yeah. If you want to learn more about the National Coalition for Art Standards, and one of the great examples that David just brought up is the ability for, whether you are a teacher or teaching artist, to build your own workbook. It is an amazing tool that is on the NCAS website, along with all kinds of other resources and information that can help advance arts education in this country today. And yes, young audience, Arts for Learning, we didn't even talk about your amazing website, David. There's a lot of information and a lot of great news. I was on the site today, and I hadn't been in a while, and I learned a lot of different things I didn't know you were even doing.
That's the idea. That's great.
Yeah. So thank you for keeping your site current and exciting. www.youngaudiences.org. So there's that. And that's right. Arts education is for everyone. Arts are education. So sign the ARE pledge indicating your support for arts education. Urge your school board to pass the resolution to fund arts education in the 23-24 school year. It will be on us before you know it. And yes, it is possible to donate to Arts Our Education to help us share the message at www.artsoureducation.org. David, thanks again, and signing off now.
Thank you.